Hey everyone, welcome to the Script and Style Show, the web show where we talk about web development and the people that make it happen. I'm Todd Gardner from Track.js JavaScript Error Monitoring, and my co-host David Walsh, creator of the popular blog davidwalsh.name. How's it going today, David?
A little slow. How are you?
Good, good. You look hot today.
Well, I mean, that's no different than usual, but our air conditioning bombed out 2 days ago. It just quit. I'm done. It's over. So the past 2 nights,
you've been running it too low. You need to turn. It needs to be like in the 70s, not in the 60s when you're running it.
Okay, I have some family members that I need you to talk to make them know this because they don't. But I woke up this morning, so I have to go to bed at night. You know, it's super hot in my house. I'm like a fish. After a fisherman catches it and throws it in the cooler, I've got like 8 cold packs around me. I'm just to try and stay cool. So it's hard to fall asleep. And then when I wake up in the morning, this is how I woke up this morning, Todd. I hear like a crash into my room, which means it's a 2-year-old because he doesn't care about anything in the morning. He walks in. I should say he walks in. He streaks in. He's wearing nothing. And my 4-year-old follows suit 10 minutes later. He's in nothing but his tidy whities. Like, it is hot. Thank God we have the repairmen. They came today. They replaced it. But hopefully
your children were clothed at the point the repairmen showed up. Though.
Yes, for sure. I wasn't, but my kids were. Anyways, hopefully I never show up to the show looking this hot ever again.
Is the AC working now?
It's working now.
Blasting cold air down on you.
It is an igloo in my house.
Well, that's great. I'm glad your AC is working. It is too hot to not have air conditioning in the Midwest. So we have a guest on our show today, don't we?
That we do, and I'm super excited about today's topic: web accessibility. With
our guest, Miss Elle Waters, a web accessibility advocate, VP of Community at Level Access, and probably most importantly, closest to my own heart, the PubConf Oslo 2018 Grand Champion.
Yay! Truly one of my greatest achievements.
Thanks so much for being on our show today.
Thank you very much.
So
excited to be here.
What does the winner of PubConf get? What do you get to brag about?
Well, first of all, just surviving PubConf is something. So like a shout out to all my fellow PubConf speakers. If you remember that you were doing it, again, there's usually a fair amount of alcohol involved and a little bit of trauma of getting up on stage for that. So just surviving PubConf, I think, is a huge win to be able to talk about. I'm a speaker at PubConf. But to be able to get to the finals, you have to be able to not only pass your first test, which is 5 minutes of speaking, usually on the flip side, the slightly not safe for work side, sardonic, cynical side, what most people do. And then you go to the final round and you're given slides that you've never seen before, and you have to speak to a topic that you didn't prepare for and be able to give it your best shot. So I would say Master Bullshitter should be like way up on that title. But in actuality, what you get is an awesome t-shirt and a fantastic bottle of spirits, which I actually have saved for next time I see everybody again, for all the NDC crowd or the PubConf crowd. I really want to take it with me and have everybody kind of share around, because we kind of skedaddled last time pretty fast. But it's beautiful. It's branded, expensive liquor.
It's a bottle of scotch that I buy and then put a little PubConf sticker on it. That's what you get. And at every future PubConf, your name is etched into the slide of previous PubConf Grand Champions.
Yeah. It's fun. It's a blast.
There needs to be like a championship belt, like WWE. I told you this before. There needs to be more on the line.
Yeah.
Than your name etched in a slide. Man.
So here's an idea. All right. So we're gonna get a little off topic, but here's an exclusive. So I was chatting with a couple of the conference organizers folks, and we at PubConf we have 10 speakers. That's the lineup, 10 people. We don't have 10 champions yet, but when we do have 10 champions, I'm going to go and contact some conferences and be like, listen, if you can get all 10 of these people, if you can fly them to your thing and just accept their talks and get them in their city, we will have a PubConf World Championship.
Yes.
And
you just got to get Lemon not to do it again then.
Yeah,
he's like
he screwed it up because now he's won multiple times. And so how do I overcome it if it's just like, all right, now it's Lemon 1 and then Lemon 1 and then Lemon 1 and then Lemon 1.
Well, now it's going to be a bit like Troy said. There are people who are really well known in this conference circuit. And so people start shaping their presentations around notable people. So Lemon's getting that sort of pseudo celebrity status that Troy has. So now it will be the next PubConf will be about taking. That'll be fun. It'll be fun to watch.
Absolutely. But we're not here to talk about PubConf or Lemon or championships. We're here to talk about web accessibility. But before we dive into that topic, how we traditionally start this off is learning a little about you and your background and how did you get into this industry, this place this crazy thing that we all do. What's your origin story?
My origin story. It's like a superhero. That's really cool.
Exactly.
So I wasn't aware of my mutant powers for a long time, but I was always fascinated with social equality and emerging technologies. And so I found myself involved in sort of online communities because I thought it was a really great equalizer because anybody with an internet access could come to the same place and share ideas and shape one another's worldview. And I thought that was phenomenal. And the more we got advanced with our technologies, the more I started seeing this. I worked in virtual worlds for a little while as well. So like life and areas like that, and did a lot of work to be able to bring people together to be able to share ideas. And that was really fascinating to me. I love dealing with that. And at some point, it was really clear to me that not everybody was being allowed into the conversation. A lot of people who get into accessibility have personal stories, either they themselves or a family member has a disability. Mine is really much more about sort of the human rights aspect of it and feeling sort of frustrated that a full 15% of people may not have the same opportunities as other people. And it's not because of some giant hurdle that you have to overcome. It's just the lack of awareness about how to make something available to everybody. And so I've always worked in really, off the wall tech jobs, and I got a job at a health insurance company. I had friends taking bets on how many days I would last because we're like, she's got a straight job. Oh my God. And, colored my hair, natural color.
Not traditionally what I would imagine to be a
tech job, innovation. But it's funny because it brings out the darkest parts of people's personalities in some way. So there was a lot of weird, vibe there, but it was still very much a straight job. And I had a director who was really concerned that I was going to bolt at any minute. And I was doing front-end web development. And he said, so you seem to be kind of a bleeding heart. So what we need to do is make our Medicare website Section 508 compliant. And I had known, because of history of doing things online, I knew a little bit about accessibility and I knew a little bit about what that meant, just, kind of surface level. And I thought, this is cool. I would totally get behind that because I could actually have like a mission where I felt like I was helping people instead of just, working for the man. And so I thought, well, this will take me like 3 months or so to kind of do this for this website. And basically, the further I delved into it, the more I understood that it was an organizational sort of paradigm shift. And a lot of people go through this when they go through like an agile transformation, where they suddenly realize the way I think about everything is really upside down and I need to rethink how I approach things. And so then it was no longer about this one specific set of techniques for a website. And it was more about how do you make organizations approach accessibility from a really inclusive way. And so I spent 5 years at that health insurance company, defying all bets, ruining the pool, and stayed there and helped build something which I felt like was a really great foundation for being inclusive design in a digital way. And about that point, I was looking for challenges, and I thought it's one thing to have one experience. It's another thing to be able to flood yourself with a lot of different organizations and seeing how they do things, so I could both learn and then teach in the future. So then I moved on to Simply Accessible, which was recently acquired by Level Access. And I probably work with maybe, I don't know, hundreds of clients in a year. And so I get to see the digital anthropologist in me totally digs it, because I'm able to really dig in and understand people's culture and their challenges. And it combines the two things I'm most passionate about, which is emerging technologies and the idea of social equality and how those things can help one another. So that's my origin story. And then I learned how to fly. So it was awesome.
So most superheroes' origin stories involve like a really traumatic event.
Yeah, that's true.
Force them into like becoming great.
Well, I think health insurance
company, like your traumatic story that forced you into it.
Getting a 9-to-5 job that had a cube. Yeah, I think that was pretty traumatic.
The walls were beige. Beige.
And they told me the coolest thing about working there was when they could have casual Fridays. And I thought, get me the hell out of. So it's true. I think that was the pressure point. Absolutely.
All right. So let's talk about the nitty gritty. So like web accessibility is what you work on with most of your clients today. Yes?
Yes. Yes.
So what is that? Like when we say web accessibility, like what are we typically talking about? Like how do you, a client comes in and they have no idea. They're like, I heard we need like to be accessible. Like what do we mean? Yeah, what does that mean?
My page performance is fine. What's the problem?
Yeah, like I just need some more ads on the page. Like what?
Yeah. So a lot of times people think about they come from very different kinds of levels, and this is overwhelmingly an education challenge right now at this point in our world in the tech industry. It's not that people are trying to be assholes and trying to be difficult and they're saying, no, I want to prevent access. It's because they just honestly aren't aware, and they aren't aware of the impact of what they do. So sometimes we've worked with people and they are saying blind people actually use the web. They actually access digital content. And then, that's becoming rarer and rarer because there's a lot of stories that will talk about inventions and things like mobile devices and that kind of stuff. And more often, people don't think about the huge spectrum that is the messiness of humanity. And so they'll think only about people who are blind, who might use assistive technology like screen readers. And instead, it's really about the idea that we're talking about, and the World Health Organization and Google both publish this, that 1 in 7 people have some kind of disability. So what that really amounts to is roughly 15% of the world population has some kind of disability, and that the more you age, the more prevalent that becomes, and you start sort of having a combination of things. You may even be born with a combination of things, but it just becomes increasingly, more challenging. And so ultimately, you find yourself faced with a relatively large minority of people who may have some mobility challenges. They may be deaf or hard of hearing. There may be people who there's a myriad of different kinds of vision impairments. You may be low vision, and so you may need to really zoom the screen in so that you can see what's on the page. You may be fully blind. You may be somebody who's colorblind. I think it's 1 in every 8 men are colorblind. And a large proportion of web developers that I meet who are male, a lot of them are actually, have some form of color blindness. It's very interesting that skews that way for that industry. And so there's this huge mixture of different kinds of things, and you may have cognitive disabilities, or you may be what is really more commonly referred to as neurodivergent, meaning it's not necessarily a disability unless somebody hasn't actually thought to include you. And so there's a lot of people who may identify as what they would call on the spectrum. So autistic disorder is no longer necessarily considered a disorder because it's really just a different way of thinking and approaching ideas and interaction. But all of those can present atypical interaction patterns or needs. And so when people design and develop for a very limited idea of how human beings interact with digital content, that's when they leave people out of the consideration and out of the conversation. So that is sort of the longish version of web accessibility or digital accessibility, is making things work for everybody on every device.
I'm really glad you provided that list, because I think there's a big misconception that accessibility is generally just visual impairment.
Yeah, it's pretty common, and it's a very they're a very vocal audience. It's also some of the barriers that are experienced by people who have visual impairments are pretty pronounced. Other disabilities, somebody might have a problem and they figured out some workaround, and you can justifiably argue that they should not have to work so hard to accomplish the same thing, but they may still be able to accomplish a task. In some scenarios with visual impairment, somebody is completely locked out of the experience. And so I think because of that, it definitely surfaces more in a conversation, and it's easier to identify somebody visually who might have a visual impairment than somebody who has maybe a cognitive disability. If sometimes you wouldn't know unless you either heard from that person or had a long enough interaction with that individual to know. So yeah, it's pretty common though to have that first impression.
Right. Sure. So you mentioned that a lot of your clients, or a lot of people who are sort of rushing for accessibility are in the education field, but it's also a massive government requirement in many cases as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of different areas where government has played a role. It's played a really important role throughout the years in a lot of different countries. And I definitely want us to think sort of outside of just the United States, because there's legislation in lots of countries. And ultimately, we do live in a very global society, especially in the digital world. And so keeping in mind that the standards body that helps us understand what is valid HTML5 is the same overarching organization that helps define, because of a lot of involvement with a lot of hardworking industry experts and advocates and people who represent different companies, they define what do we consider to be standards for accessibility. And they just recently released an update to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So this standards body, and they create basically guidelines for people to be able to use and be able to recognize this is what you should be doing to make something accessible. A lot of countries have then created laws around aligning to WCAG 2 or WCAG 2.1 eventually. And so they keep pointing back to these guidelines. Act was created before the digital revolution kind of happened in our world. And so they have phrases like public accommodation, that you should create a place, if it's a place of public accommodation, it needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. And it has been argued successfully in the courts that digital sites are not brick and mortar, but they are places of public accommodation. And overwhelmingly, it's much easier for someone with disabilities to be able to purchase from Amazon.com or Target.com than it is for them to drive or get to a ride somewhere or public transportation and go into a physical store. And so there's a lot of government requirements, but there's also for-profit organizations. And recently, Europe has come out with something that is actually spans the entire 28 member states of the EU, that each nation state has to create national laws. If they don't already have them, they have to create them. And if they have them, they need to align to some EU requirements. But Japan has that, Norway has that. Some Scandinavian countries have requirements for universal design, which is going a little further even than just looking at technical conformance. They're requiring a really holistic, inclusive approach to accessibility. So yeah, I think it's interesting because we don't like the conversation to end there. If somebody is coming to us because they feel legally required or they've gotten maybe a letter from an attorney representing people, at the same time, it's a necessary piece of this overall conversation because people don't always do the right thing if they're not aware of what they have to gain from it, or if they, feel the pressure of a lot of marketing objectives or budgetary constraints. Sometimes it requires that kind of intervention from regulations to be able to sort of equal that playing field for people and grant them access. Yeah.
So what are the kind of things that we shouldn't be doing that kind of like get in the way? Like how, like there's
what
a
are we
lot
doing
of,
wrong?
There's a lot of really weird patterns on the web that like, they'll work. Like Firefox and Chrome will make it work. But I mean, I think I have a lot of questions about, well, what is an okay rule versus what is not? Like, what should I not do?
So there's a lot of unpacking to that question. So
like I don't really know where to. Yeah, it's an impenetrable thing of like, all right, how do we start breaking into this?
So let's break it into smaller parts. The first thing that is the easy part to know, but the hard part to do. The easy part to know is you already have 70% of the skill set you need for accessibility, generally speaking. And I use that percentage. It's a fake percentage, but a real percentage, because we looked at years of testing history when we were putting all of our Simply Accessible test results into Jira, because that was like where we were logging accessibility issues. And we found, because a client actually asked us to do this, that close to 70% of the accessibility issues that we logged that were, true on violations of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines pointed directly back to standards. And so when people understand how to use semantic valid markup, when people actually incorporate progressive enhancement into what they do, not because the end goal is to make something only function when JavaScript is not disabled or not enabled. That's not progressive enhancement. Progressive enhancement is meant to build things in the lowest in the stack that you can and make it the most accessible to the most amount of devices. One of the other things that people have embraced is responsive design. And there's a lot of similarity and touch points between good responsive design, because you want to make it accessible to different viewports and devices, and the ideas behind, the concepts behind accessibility best practices. So the first and foremost thing to know is you have had the power all along. The idea is that you are able to do things in a more accessible way. And so that should feel comforting, but also challenging, because the question is, why don't you? Right? And it's possible that you may not know whether something should be a radio button or a checkbox. And it's possible that you're not actually aware of the fact that these are semantic HTML elements that serve different functions and they're communicating different things. In the same way that an unordered list means that it's not in an unordered fashion, and an ordered list actually does have a numerical sort of hierarchy to it, different HTML elements convey different kinds of meaning. And assistive technology is built to comply with standards. Now, it's the same as browsers, where different vendors may create things that are kind of quirky about one screen reader versus another. But by and large, the largest majority of best practices with web design and web development, mobile design and mobile development, are actually that which contributes to accessibility. So the better developer you are, the more likely you are to be successful with accessibility. And the fewer issues that will be difficult for you to understand how to fix. If we tell you, hey, only put one H1 on a page, because just like the Highlander, there can be only one, right? Mm-hmm. And if we say, hey, remember when you created a book report in your English class in 8th grade and you were creating an outline, well, that document outline is the same thing that you're building in your front-end markup. Now, I'm really making light of it because I'm really talking about that first piece. I know there's a lot more complexity to it, but first and foremost, that's like the biggest thing that we tell people. So if you build things according to standards, more than likely it will be accessible to a keyboard. Because why would you put it as a mouse over when you could make it, your event handlers, and make sure that they're device independent? Because you're also thinking about responsive web, right? So if you have a mobile website, you want to make sure that you're not making something dependent on a desktop viewport, that's flexible. Those kinds of things. They translate and give you those benefits with accessibility. So that's the biggest thing to take away from here. Secondly, I think that some of the principles that you carry through to that, like simpler actually is better in many cases. We get super excited about new technologies and new ways to do things. And there's nothing wrong with that, but then sort of mishandling it and preferencing something just because it's the new hotness is not necessarily the way to approach what is ultimately content delivery and interaction, right? That's what we're doing on the web is it's not just look how cool this thing is. It's I'm communicating something to you, and ideally it's a conversation between the two of us or many of us. So parallax, great, awesome. However, you really shouldn't make it something that somebody absolutely needs in order to be able to interact with your content. So giving somebody a way to pause animations, which, you know, Firefox is, you know, kind of moving towards that as well. And there's ways to do reduce motion in mobile devices. It's just a way to interact with content without it being dependent on specific, you know, exciting new technologies and things like that.
Related to it, I have never seen an implementation of parallax background that I thought, hey, you know what? That was a good idea.
Exactly.
Never. Not once. I mean, not once.
Parallax is a little bit like our Flash splash screens, right? We were so excited about Flash. We were like, look at me tween. And they're like putting these big splash screens, and you have to wait for it to load. Then you have to wait for some weird animation and figure out how to click through to the main site. And at some point, everybody was like, that's a stupid idea. That's like the worst idea ever. And I love the web standards movement. I have a huge respect for Jeffrey Zeldman because of the fact that he and all of his, you know, peers basically reminded us, like CSS Zen Garden, all those older things reminded us about content is content, presentation is presentation, behavior is behavior. And the more you decouple those things and understand that, the more accessible in the broader sense, the more inclusive you are to anybody who needs to communicate and get online and stuff. I mean, web accessibility people think about for people with disabilities. The truth is, the more inclusive you are in the way you approach things, the more likely you are to make things work for somebody who's, you know, lucky if they get 3G on their mobile device in, you know, some developing nation. And that might be a really significant experience that they're having that you've helped contribute to, again, that global conversation in helping one another. And so limiting it to the people who are most like us when we're designing and developing is a pretty echo chamber way to create content in a lot of ways.
So let me tell you a little story, and you can tell me how bad this situation, how you would approach it. This is totally not a story about me or any project that I have ever been on.
A friend of mine.
This is entirely fictional.
All right.
Let's say you have a product owner. Let's call him Bill.
Yes.
Bill gives you a design for a screen. He's like,
yes,
we really need to have like a series of options on this screen. And these options, you should be able to select only one of them. But like, here's like the rough design we want. We wanted to put a checkbox next to the one that's selected. I'm like, oh, you mean like, you know, checkbox buttons? He's like, yeah, but I want them to be radio buttons. You can only select one. I'm like, well, can I use radio buttons? He's like, no, you have to use checkbox buttons. Right. So developer, I was like, fine, take my ticket. Not me, guy.
Not me.
Not me, guy, some other guy, some other developer.
Yes.
Doing the things like, all right, so I need to write some JavaScript to like make this, you know, checkbox button act like a radio button. Cool.
Right.
Proof of concept done. It's like, all right, it kind of works. Thinking, you know what, this probably isn't entirely right, but let's float it out there. Now let's say Barb the designer. Barb the designer says, you know what, these default checkbox buttons, those don't look very good.
They're not very
ugly.
Pretty.
I want them to have brand colors. They need to be bigger. They need to have these stylings. I'm like, well, not all the browsers
support. Like Hello Kitty instead of like a regular check mark.
Yeah, I can't really style every browser. Not every browser supports styling the checkbox button. Right. Well, you just figure it out. So developer, take the ticket, figure it out. Like, all right, I guess we can draw a button, and a button can like have a different state, and that'll power like a checkbox button behind. All right. This is a story that is fictional partially, but a story that I have heard many times of like, you got to accommodate the design and the whims of people who do not always understand the underlying semantics of the web.
Absolutely.
How do you deal with this situation?
So I have a few thoughts on that. One is I completely empathize because this is not only not fictional, but all you had to do is just change the names, and it's pretty damn similar to a lot of scenarios we've encountered. One of the things to consider, and I could talk about it from a tactical level, I could tell you what you need to do today, and then let's roll back and talk about what created this situation, this perfect storm of complete nonsense of like weird backwards ways of doing things, and look at it from sort of a strategic point of view. So tactical, because I believe in like feeding with the fish first, right? Tactically speaking, what you create under the hood matters. So semantically, do not lose your true north on that. And you create the semantic structure that you know that you need to, knowing that if somebody has something that actually is meant to limit a choice, then it should be a radio button under the hood, right? You can deal with the design challenges later about the fact that you're making it look like a checkbox, but ultimately that confuses some people. But if you create something that is a checkbox under the hood and actually make the HTML element a checkbox, then no matter how much you hope that JavaScript is always going to fire and always going to work well and whatever you tested it with, you run the risk, a pretty significant risk, of limiting somebody's understanding about how to maneuver through something and triggering errors and problems. And even, especially with JavaScript, you might make it to where, and this is very often, where it's not even keyboard accessible. So then somebody with a screen reader or somebody who's a sighted keyboard user can't even get to that option to select it. So semantic structure matters. And so below the hood, and then all hail the glory of CSS. Because with CSS, you can make it look like whatever weird whim that a product owner or even a designer has decided. And you really can make it look like something pretty exceptionally weird and bizarre or whatever, and yet it's still semantically accurate below the hood. The other thing I would say is consider, and we've run into this a lot with SVG, you have different needs for different audiences. So if you know that you can't style a default checkbox to look like a radio button or the Hello Kitty, whatever that person wants, then recognize that instead of getting rid of the default checkbox, what you're doing is you're making the set of options, or is it a radio button? I've lost track of what we're doing. Radio button, whatever it is that's semantically correct, you make that something that you can visually hide, but make it accessible to somebody with a screen reader. And then you layer on top of that some visual treatment that is hidden from people who use a screen reader, and then somebody else can use. Now, huge caveat.
We hide the radio behind Hello Kitty.
Right. You hide the radio
standing in front of the radio button, like, oh, you can't see it, can't see it.
Right. But you definitely need to make sure that something that is actionable, that you can actually tab to, is something that a keyboard user could use too if they're a sighted keyboard user, because they're aiming for Hello Kitty, right? So you need to do, that's a lot of layers, so it can be done and it can be made fully accessible. And we work with that whenever we have to remediate something and we can't change the design, we work with that. So tactically, there's some layers to that, recognizing semantics matter, and then recognizing between ARIA and CSS, ARIA being accessible, rich internet application, something that is specifically meant to help bridge some accessibility gaps in the past and still works really, really well with dynamic content. If you use ARIA and CSS, visual hiding and display none and things like that, you can separate those two experiences and layer them on top of one another. We actually have an example, and I'll go hunt down that link because I didn't know we were going to have this conversation. But we have an example of being able to style default form elements and make them something fancy. That's the tactical piece.
I'm having flashbacks from my younger days of not being in a position to tell a designer or a client no, and having to do some things that my mom would be ashamed of me for to get things working, because the early days of the web didn't. I feel like a lot of the strategies for doing this sort of stuff was, I guess, common sense if you thought about it, but technically we didn't always have that ability. But moving a little bit toward coding, you mentioned ARIA. What are some of the we talk about stuff we shouldn't be doing, but let's talk about like easy wins. What can our viewers take away today? What are some of the things that they should be looking for and trying to execute to improve accessibility on the sites that they maintain or create?
So it depends on the role. So I'll talk about designers and then spend probably more time on developers. Designers, the number one thing you should focus on is color contrast. because it is, and even though it may be political from a brand color perspective, a designer's role is to champion the UX and everything that way.
But my brand colors are gray, light gray, off gray, taupe gray, and dark gray.
Which is great for your logo. And it'll be great for some border treatments, faded pixels in one way or the other. But when it comes to your headings and it comes to the backgrounds for your global headers, and when it comes to your buttons, you want people to actually take action on your site. So how can they do that if they can't see it, right? So color contrast for designers would be the #1 thing. Developers, we always say keyboard accessibility is the #1 thing. So if you're a mobile developer, that's basically saying all interactive elements need to be focusable. And most of the time, mobile developers, it's straightforward because we tell people, use the default controls as they were meant to be used. iOS and Android both have wonderful accessibility documentation. And the biggest problems we see are people trying to create custom elements. Because what happens when you create a custom element is similar to what we just talked about, which is you can make it accessible. There's just so much extra work that has to go into it that you're either going to be prone to making a mistake because you forget to do something, or it's just going to increase the amount of work that you have to do versus take a default thing and make it beautiful. So I would say from a development perspective, on the more advanced side of things, focus is a big deal. We have a lot of single page apps. People are doing things in Angular and React, and they're really exciting things. However, people aren't managing the focus. So when you have an interaction, you need to work with the designer to say, where does the focus go? After this thing has happened, where should it go next? Because if you don't rigorously control that, it becomes very confusing for keyboard users to know where they are in the page. I think those are two of the bigger things from a development perspective. Valid code sounds old-fashioned, but it really is, like if you have a form element, put a label on it, right? I mean, there's some really straightforward things. And if you can solve for it via HTML, don't reach for something fancy like JavaScript or ARIA, because those things are meant to solve specific problems and afford you with certain things, whereas HTML works all the time. So a form label, for ID, attribute there, done, solid, works everywhere, every time, right? But managing the focus is a big piece for most developers. I think that's the bigger challenge that they have.
With focus, I've definitely had periods on large projects where in order to guarantee accessibility, I spent a considerable amount of time going to every screen and just tabbing through.
Right.
And just hitting tab over and over and over again and making sure things went through. Is there a better way to do that? Yes. Like I felt like that was I felt like I literally was about to break the tab key, just staring at like if the things being selected in the right order.
2 months back. So there's some great automated tools that help you. There's things that can go into like your continuous integration that are basically JavaScript tests that can, automated testing can only capture about 25 to 30% of accessibility issues that might exist on the page. However, that's 25 to 30%, and that's a good chunk of a lot of issues. And so when you're committing a build, for example, there are things that are able to be incorporated into, of course, my company sells one, full disclosure, as do a lot of other companies. And so the idea is that it's a suite of JavaScript that you integrate into anything you're doing when you're committing that build. It's doing those automatic checks for you. So that's one thing. And this goes to the strategic piece more and more. You should be spending more time on your pattern library than testing individual unique snowflake experiences. Because if you create a pattern library, and a good friend of mine once said, even a shitty pattern library is better than no pattern library. If you create a design, that means you are working really, really hard to make that modal dialogue fully accessible and delightful, etc. Great user experience. And then you're stamping that out from that point on, and you're spending much less time in the amount of testing that you have to do. And then, this is where it gets really cool, is if you're really good at, say, test-driven development and integration, some of those standards at the process level, if you're really good at understanding that and you create a design system, you can create JavaScript rules that are testing for deviations from that pattern, And that reduces the amount of testing you have to do significantly, because then you're just testing where anybody did something a little weird compared to what you have as your pattern. Salesforce has the Lightning system. BBC has GEL, the global experience language. LinkedIn has several different iterations. The last time I was looking at it, it was called Katy Perry, but I'm sure they've moved on since then. Shopify has Polaris. And so the magic to being able to make this sustainable and to really feel proud of what it is that you're building is to put a lot of thought into the original concept and then template that, because it gives people a consistent user experience and it reduces the dev time, and the future devs who are maintaining your code will be sending you love letters like, thank you for not making me have to forensically figure out what you did.
So I have never known any dev to appreciate their forbearance.
That's because you're having to deal, it's a cascade of shitty code that you have to then figure out. And then when you start off doing a brand new design, if you don't have a pattern library, you're still having to bespoke your way through it, right? So you have like 5 modal dialogues and unique circumstances. And when you patch things like the JavaScript radio button Hello Kitty checkbox scenario, I don't expect you to get a thank you letter from a dev who received that next.
No. If the previous guy is now your manager, you better be thankful and sending them a lot of stuff. Are the pattern libraries, the Katy Perrys and such, are those open source that people can go out and grab?
There are certain patterns, I think, that the BBC releases. I don't think LinkedIn is. eBay used to have theirs. I think it was eBay and Yahoo. They used to have theirs open source. I'm pretty sure Shopify has some of it. It's various states of comfort level from executives, I think, as to whether or not they want to have a sense of ownership. But Bootstrap has a lot of accessibility features built into it. I would say that it's a good starting point. When you get into the more dynamic JavaScript-related content, the features that they have that are dynamic, I would say that's a little bit sketchy at times. They're still working on that piece. But Bootstrap has some good foundational aspects that are worth looking at. But I think that we may be releasing a pattern library in the future, that we have one that we've been working with, but it's difficult because pattern libraries are so contextual, and so it's difficult to translate one-to-one into your organization. Target has a tremendous pattern library that they've worked very hard to be able to make accessible as well. So there's a lot of organizations that do it, and usually they'll start with something, and then they'll, continue to work with their UX team to be able to make it like a product, and they'll actually have, a full-on team that supports it.
I have worked with teams before that've had like user experience libraries, like here's what everything's supposed to look like, and here's code samples and stuff like that, and it makes things amazingly easy as a dev to even when I'm like riffing off of I know roughly what the customer or what the business unit wants or whatever, but I don't have like a formal design. Like, oh, well, here's what the inputs are going to look like, and it's going to be this button, it's going to be this thing, and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So you're saying that there's non-billable work that will actually save you money and keep your sites accessible down the road. That's a tough. That's
what do you mean? It's not you bill for creating the pattern library too. That's part of your deliverable package, man.
Yeah, I guess so.
Right. Right. I mean, it's part of a project. So a lot of people, we work with a lot of clients who say, this one e-commerce team or this one product team is sort of the flagship, and we have a big redesign effort, and we're expecting to use some of the work from this team's project in other lines of business. And that's a very common scenario that we work with enterprise clients, and they're trying to leverage the work that they're doing on something that's pretty front-facing and consumer-facing for a lot of other lines of business. And the only difference is do things properly and actually start keeping, people focused on the idea that there should be patterns. And, again, part of this is if you talk to marketing team members who want to go do their own special snowflake thing, and I work a lot with business leadership and things like that. And one of the biggest compelling things is you don't get sued and you increase your market share by roughly 15%. How about that? And then if you're doing it really, really well, you make a case study out of that. You present at a conference about what you're doing to be more inclusive, and there's this huge brand loyalty that comes along with that. So you make the business case for it basically within project work. To Todd's point, though, it shouldn't be non-billable. It should be something that pays for itself within a project alone.
So no excuses, people.
No excuses.
You put the work on, the sales team to make sure that, part of the project deliverable is a highly accessible pattern library for the client to go and take forward.
Absolutely. I think so. And I think that there's too much best practice out there and evidence to show that even outside of accessibility, what the benefits of a design system and pattern library are. There's just tons of evidence to show that this is how people are able to go to market faster, because they're able to build new things faster, because developers are able to just go through that, not be confused. There's no regression testing, back and forth defect logging, because you're basically building out of some templated awesome Lego blocks. So yeah, I mean, it's the way to do it. I think that people feel intimidated by that pretty often, because it sounds like, here's this mountain and it's beautiful, go climb it. And, really at this point, trying to make sure that developers have semantic markup and it's keyboard accessible. That alone, huge wins. And build your stuff to where it's actually semantically meaningful, then you're going to go really far with accessibility. So you could do something today, and while you're, pitching for your pattern library tomorrow.
So what are some common misconceptions that you run into as you're working with clients, of where people might have the opposite perspective of what you would say is correct?
Well, the first one is that that it's a marginalized user group, right? Not that many people. Why would I build this, why would I put this much effort into something for accessibility when we're really talking about, I don't even know how many people with disabilities use my website. So why would I bother, right? Assuming they're not even looking at litigation, they're like, why would I do that? And people are still, though, looking at making sure that they have IE Microsoft Edge support. And so that's always my joke is you have 15% of the world's population versus 3.2% of internet users actually support Internet Explorer, and you can see it from your stats, and yet got to make sure it's browser compatible with that. And so there's a real misconception how people it benefits. I think that people assume that it's mysterious and difficult and complex, and that ARIA and some fancy JavaScript, and that there's these sort of really deep level machine learning AI kind of solutions that are needed. And it's much less sexy than that. It's really just, know the basics and do the basics first. Then you can get into some cool fancy stuff. But I think those are the two biggest things that people have. That their customers are not customers. And, I have two responses. One is you don't know, because there's no way to be able to really capture all of that data. A lot of people don't use assistive technology who have disabilities. The second is, well, no, they're not your customers. Would you like to change that?
Yeah. I feel like accessibility is eBay's excuse for looking terrible for so long.
That's the other thing. Thank you. The other common misconception is that accessibility has to make your stuff suck and look terrible. So we actually worked with a team, Scribd. They're basically a fantastic online reading experience. And we worked with them for the last couple of years, and they're starting to present sort of their story and their journey about accessibility. When we first started working with them, their biggest concern was, this is going to ruin the whole design aesthetic of our user experience. And we were like, try us. Seriously. Because good design. And so they have beautiful, delightful experiences. And because their color contrast is enough, it's actually great on a mobile device, and people aren't standing there squinting, trying to zoom in and stuff. It's incredibly flexible, and because of that, they have a lot to say about how beautiful their things are because they're accessible. So, but government websites aren't helping us much because they kind of suck. And that's what people look at, right? Some of the worst websites we've ever seen have been government websites from an accessibility point of view. So
yeah, you go to a U.S. government website, and on the bottom it says, meeting all the compliance, but they're using a Java applet to like render part of it, right. And it's like 8-point font, and right. Makes me go through like 6 different like next statements, agreeing to every possible thing that could ever go wrong.
And yet that thing is
luck. It's not a good luck.
That thing is probably compatible with the screen reader they chose to test it with. And so that's their understanding, is screen reader compatibility equals accessibility. And that's not the same. There's lots of people who don't use a screen reader who, would find 8-point font kind of hella difficult to be able to use, including myself.
Yeah, like I don't think I qualify in those things. I mean, my wife thinks I don't know the difference between red and orange, so maybe I'm colorblind. But I found that site inaccessible. Yeah. I'm like, when it says, "Oh, you require a newer version of Java to run this page," I'm like, that's inaccessible right there. I can't install Java.
I'm sorry, this is a barrier. I'm calling this a barrier. Yeah, it's funny because I think that's the other piece too. Is a lot of people think accessibility are these tidy boxes, and people are messy. We're all on this big spectrum, and so what is accessible to you one day might actually be pretty difficult the next day, as far as what you're able to accomplish. A lot of people have different varying levels of energy from day to day, or they may have a tremendous amount of anxiety because of, I don't know, maybe they're paying a speeding ticket online. And that changes the way that people are able to, maybe something is not easy to use, but one day they're able to work. The next day they're like, I can't. I keep getting errors and it's freaking me out. Whereas if it was made in a way that was really empathetically accommodating in that way, then even on your worst days, you'd probably be able to get through that experience.
Yeah, I totally see that. Like you're dealing with like a court filing or taxes or something like that. And it's kind of a high stress situation.
And that's what's interesting, because banks deal with that a lot from an accessibility point of view, because it is no freaking joke, right? When you're like filling out things on a website for your banking information, I don't think that most people are like super chill when they're doing that. They want to make sure I'm paying a bill from my bank account. It's all going okay. Yeah. So emotional state does play a role. I mean, it's not something that can be legislated, but it definitely plays a role as far as ease of use for people, for sure.
So you mentioned something about tooling. The company you work for makes some tooling in the space. What sort of tools are we talking about? Like, what kind of stuff do we have available that can make the developer and the designer's life easier to understand the stuff and not spend all day clicking tab and measuring the difference between color contrast?
Wearing your tab, keep that. Yeah. So from a design perspective, there's a lot less tooling available, because it is a lot more about the interaction and look and feel of something. But it's very straightforward and mathematical to be able to test for color contrast. And then with regards to how to be able to test for things in the design phase, really test it with real users. Usability testing can be conducted with people with disabilities. You just have to think about what it is that you're testing with and which user group might be the best to accommodate that and to provide feedback. So we recommend really best practices, and there's a lot of them. Actually, the BBC has some great mobile guidelines for accessibility. For the things, it's more resources and then working with people directly in the design phase. Developers have a plethora of tools available to them. Everything from free toolbars in the web. So we actually recommend the web developer extension or add-on in Chrome or Firefox. Even though it's not traditionally an accessibility tool, it's very useful in being able to understand how you have, alt text on your page or things like that. And it's very quick, especially from a business user perspective. The best thing I think for developers is about the idea when you're doing some sort of unit testing or you're doing any kind of continuous integration is to look for those things. And some are free and some are paid. On our website, we have like a little one-page website called webaccessibility.com, easy to remember. There's free versions of the things that you can integrate into your systems to be able to do that. Then there's some guided testing tools where it'll test something and then kind of share with you what it's finding. And it's like guided manual testing. And those are available in a lot of different ways. I think that the best tools are the earliest in your particular work that you can find them. There are, of course, ways to test production websites, but we've pretty much, as an industry, we've moved away from that other than sort of from a monitoring perspective, because if you get 15,000 you worked on 6 months ago as a developer, that's very hard for you to be able to figure out like how to incorporate that, because it's so divorced and decoupled from the work that you do. So definitely looking for tools, both there's some free and paid ones, and some people have rolled their own and they created JavaScript rules that they're basically putting into their life cycle to test for. So there's a lot of tools out there, and they're, like I said, they're really effective. One of the things that I think is kind of cool that it's a little bit in sort of a new sort of maybe beta phase. It's called Alchemy, and it works with a set of JavaScript that we have that's an analytics package, and it's not unlike Google Analytics in that it's tracking all of the page views and things like that, but it's really informed by a lot of accessibility, like 20 years of accessibility understanding. And it gives you trends and insights and shows you areas that you're most at risk, and things like comparing page traffic with user behavior and interaction complexity and severity of an accessibility issue to kind of zero in and sort of triangulate.
What was that one called?
That's called Access. Access Analytics, and then its sister tool, Alchemy, is the same JavaScript package. And that's a little bit, this is how I describe it from a business perspective. It's like Mad Lib, but for fixes. So it understands the framework, and then if, say, image alt and it's like missing an alt text, then it allows you to type in what those unique identifiers are, those unique values, and it magically, not so magically, but it automatically fixes some of those automated things on your site.
Gotcha.
So it's
there's another really popular library called Alchemy.js that's a graph mapping library. And I was like, this doesn't look like what she's talking about here.
No, I'll send you some information about it. But I think it's cool because basically one of the biggest challenges about fixing accessibility issues is the fact that things have already been launched. And so the amount of cycle up time that it takes, and the budget and the effort to get that back into the life cycle could be pretty challenging. So if you have somebody who's not a developer who can apply fixes to a page live, and they do it not just on that one page, but like wherever that issue exists, and it can, identify it by, like, say, the CSS selector or whatever it is that and it can basically cascade throughout the entire site. So it's like a way to empower like QA testers in being able to apply fixes, which is kind of cool because they should be part of the solution too, right? They shouldn't always just be finding the problems.
Yeah, that's no fun.
So it's cool stuff. Throughout the accessibility industry, people are looking at ways to make this, like looking at machine learning and AI, and ways to make this more intelligent, the way that we're approaching issues and fixes.
Well, that's really cool. I think there's a lot to go on here. That webaccessibility.com, it looks super helpful.
Good. We're redesigning it, of course.
Why was it not accessible?
No, it's not that. It's that the Simply Accessible acquisition, we have tons of content that we want to have somewhere, and it's all these sort of mobile accessibility testing primers and things like that and stuff. So that, and we're thinking about like creating a forum so people can ask questions and chat and stuff like that. So
That'd be really cool. That'd be really cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're wrapping it up. So let's go around and kind of put like what our big takeaway from the day is. David, how about you go first?
My big takeaway. I was really excited to talk about accessibility with Elle because it's a lot like our talk with Scott Helm and CSP, right? Where much of the time developers are simply satisfied that something looks good and it works. But accessibility is not just that. Accessibility is something where you do need to take things a step further. And you can always justify security because it's a word that scares people, right? Like this is insecure, and then people, whoa, we better fix this, or someone's going to lose money or get hacked or something. You can't really strike the fear into people the same way with accessibility, but it's still incredibly important. And I guess my big takeaway from that is, Elle said it best in that if you follow semantics, you've done most of the job already. It's not something we're going to have to sit there with a screen reader all day and, tab and hope that you get the feedback that you want. If you do things semantically correct and you don't go overboard with stuff that you probably don't need, AKA you sometimes find the courage to tell the designer or the client no, you're going to be in really good shape, and that's going to make a huge impact for a lot of people. And actually, the one thing that I thought was really interesting is that, and somehow I didn't pick this up in myself, but accessibility becomes more important as people get older. It's not like you were born with a visual impairment. I've had to start, don't tell anyone this, command plussing to get bigger text on the screen because I'm old. I'm terribly old. And so it's not a problem that goes away. It's a problem that's going to become more and more apparent. So I learned a ton. It was excellent. How about you, man? What'd you learn?
I really like that we talked about like a range. It's like, it's not, when you're talking about web accessibility, it's not about like, oh, we have to deal with people who, are blind. It's not about that. It's about like this range of everybody has a different, like a different level of accessibility problem. And it could be, it's not people with disabilities. It's people who were like, maybe they had too much to drink last night and they just need to zoom in a few times. Maybe I'm not enough coffees in for the day. Maybe I'm super stressed out because somebody's suing me and I need to like deal with this court filing. And like, there's all this range. Like accessibility isn't about like dealing with people who need accessibility, because everybody needs accessibility at some point in time. And so if we build our sites in such a way that like, if I'm having a rough night and I can like just zoom in and like, it's not weird color contrast and I can just see it easier, that not only helps me, it helps your users, it helps people who like need this in their everyday lives. It helps everybody. And I think that's a much better way to sell this than trying to like whittle away at like, hey, you shouldn't be shitty to these people. Like,
I think that's great. Yeah. So we tend to talk about inclusion, digital inclusion more, because that's really what we're talking about, right? Is include everybody. Why wouldn't you? Right?
Don't be shitty.
Everybody. Don't be shitty. Exactly. That'll be my new t-shirt. You'll see me at NDC and I'll have it. Don't be shitty. Include everybody.
I love it.
Absolutely.
I'll take one. All right. Anything else? What's your big takeaway? And anything else you'd like to share with us?
I love hearing your perspectives, and I love because I learned something more, and I just wanted to say thank you for having me on your show, because it's always really fascinating and interesting to hear people's perspective, and it makes the work that we do better, because it's better that we understand what the needs are, what the gaps are, and what your insights are. And so the whole don't be shitty, I think that's exactly the best takeaway. I will say too, that I'll do one small plug for a free webinar that I'm giving on Tuesday. It's called Lean Accessibility, and it's about incorporating accessibility into the Agile life cycle, because accessibility and Agile are like peanut butter and jelly. And it's not just because I'm married to an Agile coach that I say that, but it is also because they're both awesome for each other. So.
And the link to join that has magically appeared in the live chat just now. So if you want to hear more about that, go and sign up to be part of our webinar.
Very cool.
All right, anything else?
That's it. I'm so excited. I want to hear, I would love to keep in touch with anybody who tuned in. And so I'm on Twitter at Nethermind. If somebody has follow-up questions, if anyone wants to build the Hello Kitty turducken awful experience, then let me know. I'm down with that. About what not to do.
All right. Well, that sounds great. Thank you so much for being on our show. I think this is a great and necessary thing for us to be talking about. Web accessibility is important for everybody. Don't be shitty. Great episode. Thank you so much. We'll be back next week. We have a guest set up next week. We're going to have Maggie Pint on the show to talk about Moment.js and dealing with terrible date objects and working with JavaScript at Microsoft. It'll be a good show. So be sure to tune in. Until then, I'm Todd.
I'm David.
Thanks so much. See you next time.
Adios.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, and she left.